I'm Crystal Parikh, and I am the director of the Asian Pacific American Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our event tonight, Terrifying Drag, a conversation with Faluda Islam and LaWhore Vagistan. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment for us to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We would also like to recognize that New York City is currently home to approximately 100,000 people who identify as indigenous, including many peoples from the Pacific. We at the Institute affirm our commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Thank you. Okay, so tonight's event is part of our year-long focus at the Institute on In the Wake of War, in which we consider the many different kinds of war that have shaped our community's existence, as well as relations of solidarity and care forged in the face and aftermath of violence. We are collaborating on this theme with our artists in residence for 2019-2020, Ocean Vuong, and we hope you can also join us for a symposium on November 1st, citing APA studies, a celebration of scholars, as well as a panel discussion on December 5th, Imperial Entanglements, Permanent Conditions of War in the Pacific. To stay updated on these and other APA Institute activities, you can follow us on social media at APA Institute on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and consider signing up to receive our newsletter, which you can do on our website, apa.nyu.edu, or at the registration table. And we'd also like to thank the NYU Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality for their generous co-sponsorship of tonight's program. And I want to thank the APA Institute staff, as always, who make this and every one of our events possible. And then I would like to briefly introduce, you can find a full biography of his work in the program, but I'd like to briefly introduce our moderator for tonight, Alpesh Kantilal Patel, who also curated this event, and then he will be introducing our speakers. So Alpesh Kantilal Patel's art historical scholarship, criticism, and curating reflect his queer, anti-racist, and transnational approach to contemporary art. The author of the monograph, Productive Failure, Writing Queer Transnational South Asian Art Histories, was published in 2017 by Manchester University Press. He has been a contributor to many anthologies, academic journals, and international art publications such as Freeze, Hyperallergic Art in America, and Art Forum. Terrifying Drag is research for his next book project, tentatively entitled Transregional Entanglements, Sexual Artistic Geographies. Patel is currently a visiting professor at the APA Institute here at NYU. Please welcome Alpesh Patel.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. It was so nice to get such an amazing response. We sold out, I think, a couple of weeks ago, which is just absolutely fantastic. I wanted to just start out with just a few thanks. Thanks to the APA Institute, to Crystal, to Lauren Chen-Schultz, the Associate Director, and most especially to Amita Ragnani, who's been such a joy to work with and has helped all the details, gotten all of us from different parts of the nations to come here together. So thank you, Amita, for that. I also want to thank the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, that's directed by Gayatri Gopinath, and really honored that you're here. You have written so much about queer South Asian diasporic visual culture, so it's wonderful to have you in our audience today. And the bulk of my thanks for sure goes to our other guest here today, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto to my right, and Kareem Khubchandani. I want to present them, give an introduction more formally in a second, but first I will sort of describe how this event came into being. In 2017, there was a conference at the Queen's Museum that was organized by Jayshree Apachandani, and it brought together a number of curators and academics and writers and activists, a number of interested parties that wanted to take stock of South Asian American art now. During that conference, which was amazing, I had the opportunity to see LaWhore Vagistan and Faluda Islam perform for the first time live. We didn't have a chance at that conference to really, I think, have more of a discussion about queer South Asian performance. And in the back of my head, I kept on thinking that's something that I wanted to address at some point. Sort of fast forward to late last year, early this year, the Journal of the Asian Diasporic Journal of Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures and Americas had a special issue that was focusing on the hegemony in the South Asian diaspora. And I thought this is a perfect opportunity for me to maybe weigh in and start a conversation dialogue with Kareem and Zulfi. So I reached out to them, and they were incredibly gracious in answering some questions that I put together related to the aesthetics of their practices, looking at ideas like parody and pastiche, futurity. All these things we'll talk about a little bit more later, I think, in more depth. Through that process, we ended up having an interview that will be published in that journal. It's going to come out in a couple of weeks. That sort of eventually led here to this panel. We're sort of hoping to sort of continue the momentum and have more conversations. So I'm going to formally introduce our two speakers now before we have that longer discussion in just a bit. I will start out with Kareem Khubchandani, who's the Mellon Bridge Assistant Professor in Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, and the program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Tufts University. Kareem's alter ego is LaWhore Vagistan. She's everyone's Stacy Drug auntie. She brings the nightclub to the classroom and vice versa, teaching critical race, post-colonial, and gender theory through lip sync and lecture. I want to be there. LaWhore has performed in the US at the Austin International Drag Festival, the Queens Museum, Jack Theater, Bronx Academy of Arts and Dance, Boston Outsider Multi-Arts Festival, and in India at the Kitty Sue nightclub franchise. Her music videos, Sorry, spelled S-A-R-I, as well as There's a Stranger in My House, are available on YouTube. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, born in Damascus, Syria, is a performer, visual artist, and curator based in San Francisco, California. His drag zombie alter ego is Faluda Islam, who is less a drag queen and more a drag comrade, more extra than terrestrial and more dead than alive. A warrior drag queen, branded comrade by some and terrorist by others, she was part of a band of bearded Muslim queens who roam the world, striking fear into American and European-backed regimes and rebel groups. She was killed in the Great Queer Revolution, but has been resurrected through Wi-Fi technology and comes back to this earth in time to tell us of the future and what it is we need to brace ourselves for. She has as much contour as conviction, eyeshadow that stands for egalitarianism, and heels to stamp out heteropatriarchy. So please help me welcome our two guests.
Hello. Yes, I'm so happy to be here. I'm really grateful to Crystal and Amita and Gayatri, to Alpesh for curating this, but really also to Zulfi, my sister in dismantling Sindhi respectability. Thank you for the mess we're about to create today. So I'd like to introduce you to LaWhore Vagistan. That's her. This was her last week. And the name Lahore coming from Lahore, the city in Pakistan, where my family's originally from what is now Pakistan. They're from Hyderabad, Sindh. So Lahore to gesture to Pakistan instead of India, but W to let people know that I'm here to work. And that sex work is work too. And of course, Vagistan, like a good post-colonial theorist, to suture back the subcontinent after all the multiple violences. It's my, Lahore uses particular pronouns like she, her, hers, or doctor, but also auntie. Auntie because my drag and my aesthetics are really inspired by the South Asian women who raised me in Accra, Ghana, where I grew up. They taught me that leopard print is a neutral, that sequins are day wear. But they taught me how to dance. So there's my mom and two of my aunties, and there's me copying exactly what they do at these cultural nights that they stage for each other in Accra. I started doing drag, and LaWhore came to being in Chicago. I started a queer Bollywood night as a fundraiser, and inspired by Desi Licious and Sholay events and Salga here in New York, I wanted to host something in Chicago, and I was like, there has to be drag, because there's always drag at those events, and I couldn't find anyone to do drag there, so I did it myself. And so I sort of went to a thrift store and bought whatever ethnic wear I could find. Things, I actually found that skirt and put all the sequins on it myself. Bought a cheap wig and got into whiteface because I didn't know what contouring was then. But really, and performed on this improvised little bench in the side of this bar. But it was, I didn't think very much of it myself, but people asked for more, and we kept doing this fundraiser, so I kept doing drag, and from there, that's where she began. But I also had my own queer aunties along the way, like Ifti Naseem, who started Sangat Chicago, one of the earliest queer South Asian organizations, and Ifti was a car salesman, a Pakistani immigrant who brought his entire family to the U.S., and he would walk me around Devon Avenue in Chicago, pointing to all the store clerks, being like, "I've had her, I've had her, I've had her." But just really was someone who taught me that does the auntie work of holding cultural memory and giving gossip, right? And I think that's really important auntie work that she does. But like I said, I am an academic drag queen, and this is me at the Tufts Library, hosting an event called The Library is Open. And LaWhore, of course, has received her PhD in lip sync and dance from the Lahore University of New Drag, also known as LUND. She currently teaches at the Drag Institute of Calcutta, now Kolkata, also known as DIC. And of course, she has very important publications, like Can the Submissive Bottom Speak? And of course, one that she wrote while she was in graduate school under Western Thighs. And of course, her most important publication, this bridge called My Neck, My Back, My Pussy, and My Crack. So I hope you're teaching her work. She would really like that. But I want to talk a little bit about why aunties are terrifying, and why it is terrifying to do auntie drag as well. Don't I look great in this sari? 'Cause I'm giving you this sexy body. Don't I look great in this sari? I know right now I look so fly when I rock my Desi style. You don't wanna mess with this auntie, 'cause she'll put that salt in your chai tea. Don't I look great in this sari? I know right now I look so fly when I rock my Desi style. So there's with artists like Hate Copy and several other, I think, young South Asian artists, there's a lot of cultural production happening, but really premised on this idea of trust no auntie. That the auntie is a figure of surveillance and gossip and authenticity police that I think a lot of a younger generation are thinking about the auntie as something they want to move away from. And as I said, I get my drag aesthetics from my aunties. And I'm interested in thinking about through my scholarship and my performance, what are the things that aunties give us that actually might be productive? How do they hold cultural resources that are not white, right? How do they teach us to do gender and sexualities in ways that are not white, Western colonial? Sometimes still informed by caste privilege as well. But just provide us alternatives to be in our bodies in different ways. And I presented my work on this at a conference, and someone was like, well, you don't understand the terror aunties have inflicted on me. I just cannot go there with you. And so I think that, and so I hope that that's something we can think about together. But also drag queens are doing terrifying things like, white drag queens especially, like performing songs like Firework, Katy Perry's Firework, but as a suicide bomber. And she made it to Drag Race, like that's who we're letting on our screens. But then there are things that South Asian drag queens are doing, like Tara Wrist, who performs the horrific or the horrifying Sri Devi in Nagina at Sholay, I think last year. So her name is Tara Wrist, like terrorist? Get it? Yeah. Ah. So for those who've seen Nagina and know how campy and terrifying Sri Devi is in that movie, I think it's really exciting that she decides to perform that in a club space. I recently did a tour through Central New York, and it's the first time I received national attention for my work from Campus Reform, who, and then it was picked up by another conservative outlet, but they decided that this was the picture they wanted to put. The like 3 most terrifying things: Muslim women, drag queens, and public transportation, and one as the thing to. But they this is how they promoted the event, and so they were really terrified that there was a drag queen who teaches at our universities who talks about Islamophobia and says we're not making this up, and so simply just by doing this on college campuses and bringing this messy queer anti-knowledge to college campuses is something terrifying to conservatives, and I'm really excited to keep doing that. Thank you.
Thank you for that, LaWhore. That was beautiful. And yes to dismantling Sindhi respectability. We're both Sindhis, and we bond over that frequently. Can you all hear me if I talk like this too? I have a habit of just, yeah. So that's me, Faluda Islam. So Faluda Islam kind of came about at an interesting point in my life. I had graduated from grad school feeling like, what was the point? And I quickly made my way to a queer POC gathering. In the woods. It was a fairy space. And I saw my first ever drag show, but in the woods. And, you know, of course we were camping, but there was lights and a fan and, you know, really wonderful sound system. And I met this wonderful drag queen called Grace Towers, who I saw out of drag, and I saw in drag, and I saw how captivated everyone was, and how people were listening. And this was just after Orlando. This was just after the Pulse massacre. And this was sort of another huge, I mean, I think for many people, it affected many people in the Latinx community, many people in the queer Muslim community, where we, especially in the queer Muslim community, we felt, you know, are we to blame? You know, it's not our fault. We're with you. And it was an odd place to be in. Of course, it's not our fault. Of course, this shouldn't be the conversation, but it did end up there. So I started thinking about drag as a political potential, as a potential for radical change. And it led me to think about revolutionary movements in South Asia, in the Arab world, in North Africa. I'm Lebanese on my mother's side and Pakistani on my father's side. And both of these, both of these lineages are saturated with histories of struggle, of histories of death, of histories of martyrdom, of histories of remembrance. But at the same time, there's no sense of queerness embedded in these histories. And there's often this idea that, well, we didn't have time, or that's not important, or whatever it is that people say to reason with themselves. So I thought, well, why don't I start doing a project where I search for this intifada in the future, this struggle. For those of you who don't know what the word intifada means, it's an Arabic word which means uprising. So how do we insert queer bodies into these histories of revolution, into these histories of anti-imperialism? So Faluda Islam kind of, she came out of that. She started in the nightclub. She still is in the nightclub. But then she eventually decided to become a zombie because I guess people would listen more. I'm not sure why I did that. No, I'm joking. No, I know why I did that. I'll tell you about it later. So I am currently searching for the next intifada. And, I brought drag into my visual practice. I'm also a visual artist, at a certain point. And I started merging the two worlds together. This video installation, the whole installation is called Guerrilla Jang Ke Hatiyar, which means weapons from a guerrilla war, but we don't have time to talk about that. There's a video inside. We'll get closer. And it's called 533. You can see the numbers in Urdu around it, in Urdu and Arabic, and it's named after Shahida Sanam Headley, who's a big inspiration to my work. For those of you who may not know who she is, who she was the first ever female suicide bomber, or as she called herself, self-sacrificer. The term suicide bomber is a CNN and BBC word. And she was also the very first person to record a video before she died. The very first person, not male, female, whatever, the very first person. And in that video, she talks to her parents who don't know she's going to do this. She was 18 years old. And she said, "Don't mourn me. Instead, dance for me, as if you were at my wedding. Because today I marry the soil of southern Lebanon." And it made me think of queer possibilities within these histories. Someone whose life was cut so short and told her father, "I'm not going to walk down the aisle to my wedding with you. Instead, I'm going to do this." So Faluda Islam, we're getting closer, has a sort of conversation with her. And we were talking about this, Alpesh, in our interview about parody and pastiche. And I can't remember what I said then, but parody is not necessarily in the comedic sense, but definitely when thinking about these histories, how do we make them live again? So I embody that kind of thing. So the video mixes Shahida Sanam Headley's voice with mine. So I also record a farewell video similar to the style that she did. And instead, I talk about love and the radical possibilities of love and what exactly it means to marry the soil. What does it mean to marry the earth? What lies in the contract between flesh and soil? What does it mean to marry God? So that's her in hers, and that's me over there. And these are installation elements that I made as well for the video. So the video is then expanded into a performance called Alif is for Awakening, where I come out as my zombie self, and the same setup is created that was in the performance, and I'm sort of lost. I'm a zombie who's been resurrected to continue the good fight. And it very much thinks about these histories of martyrdom. When we miss people who have died and we seek them again, we want them to come back so that they can answer our problems. And for me, this comes from a very personal place. My father was killed when I was 6 years old by police outside of our home. And I've always lived with the memory of, you must be like him. Or, let's bring him back, what would he say? Or rather, maybe we should just let him rest. So the zombie is resurrected and can't speak. She's not able to speak. She's not able to say anything. She's only able to do grunts and groans. And every time she does speak, Shahida Sanam Headley's voice comes in instead, and then I lip sync to her, taking on from that tradition. And then my own farewell video comes on, and then I start to lip sync to that while while eating plastic flowers. It's quite uncomfortable eating plastic flowers. I don't know if you've ever done that. And numerology is a huge part of my practice. So I mentioned the 533. I realized I didn't explain that. So 533 is the numerological value of her name, and in Arabic there's a system called abjad, which is where there are words that actually translate to numerological values. So for example, alif is 1, B is 2, Sheen is 100, and there's similar practices embedded within the Hebrew language, within Greek, and they all have great mystical power to the point where even if you have a prayer, you can simply say the numerological value. So the numerological value of Shahida Sanam Headley's name is used to attempt to resurrect her, a failed attempt to resurrect her by Faluda Islam as well. And then the whole performance ends with me lip-syncing to an Urdu cover of Zombie by the Cranberries while I put on a wedding dress and then go out to marry God, but I just walk out of the theater. Not yet. Anyway, so that's me. That's what I look like. Oh, and this collaboration is a huge part of my practice. My practice is very futurist. It is futurist. And a really wonderful person called Jasim Hindi, who's also an incredible artist, performance artist, once said to me, futurism is not a solo project. And when we've seen futurism as a solo project, and as in the case with the Italian futurists, or even as Dubai, he says that Dubai is futurist, therefore it shouldn't exist now. It shouldn't be here. And I don't know, there are many other reasons why it shouldn't be there. What was I saying? Right, so futurism is not a solo project, so I consider collaboration hugely important to this practice, not only in terms of thinking about skills and techniques, but also how are we doing futurism together. So that's me. So I collaborate often with with Gabriel Christian of Up Above, whose performance name is Black Bussy. And they are a horse, a half-horse humanoid creature, as well as Jose Abad, who's the unicorn down below. And we did a performance called Alif is for Annals. And within that performance, we investigated not only the connections between Black and Brown solidarity movements, between Muslim and Black solidarity movements, both in the Arab world, in South Asia, as well as in the United States, but also what are the things that separate us. The performance was a lot about tension embodied in these strange humanoid creatures. And also in pastiche, has anyone ever seen Un Chant d'amour by Jean Genet? It's a really interesting film. It's about Algerian prisoners who are arrested by French authorities in the 1950s at the height of the anti-imperialist struggle in Algeria. And they fall in love through prison walls. So similar to sort of thinking about these histories, Faluda Islam inserts herself into one of the prisoner's characters, partly because I do have a crush on the other person, and I was like, just go away, I want to be there. But anyway, she inserts herself into these histories in order to think about ways that queer bodies can not only be seen in histories that matter, but in fact are essential to their success. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. There's so much rich information that you've given us that will, I think, take me a while to process, but we'll attempt to go through some of the ideas in my head. And just to give everyone a sense, we're going to have a discussion for about 45 minutes or so, then there'll be a Q&A, and there's a reception that we'd love for all of you to stay as well to have sort of more casual conversation. The first question I wanted to ask actually is connected to how I normally have seen your work, which is through the image, through photography. When this interview gets published in the Journal of Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures in the Americas, there are a number of images that are part of it. I wanted to make sure there was a lot of imagery. How do you feel like the photograph functions in your practice? Is it a document? Is it another kind of artwork? Do you work with the photographers that are doing this? I'm curious what you think, especially again, since for me, this is where I'm engaging with the work.
So photography, I mean, for me, it's really just a matter of documentation. You know, it is documentation for that purpose. But I think also thinking about the way the world is right now, photography, especially in the context of social media, is a way of showing that we exist. And I think, especially when thinking about Pakistan and the fact that I have so many links there and so many people from Pakistan see these images and see queer Muslims being reflected back at them, I think that becomes important. For me, it's more the moving image as opposed to photographs that really function in my work in terms of video, especially as a zombie. The video serve as references to life, to memory, and I think of memory as a kind of JPEG file, or like a video that, the more you share it, the more it corrupts, the more it glitches, the less of it you truly remember. And especially within our political global context, there seems to be a collective global amnesia around so many things. So videos and images serve, they can serve to prove or disprove. They can be very powerful things. So that's really, especially the moving image, that's really where, that's really what features in my work most.
I think documentation as a nightclub drag queen is really important. Because I need to populate my Instagram in order to circulate in the ways that I'd like to. Again, because I don't get to perform in nightclubs very often. I'm not invited to. My work is not always legible in those spaces. So having some documentation that can circulate online, that people tag, that has that kind of cross-border travel through the internet is really important. I haven't done a lot of photo shoots per se, but when I do, I can't find my angles. That picture that I keep using is because it's like the one picture that I'm like, oh, she's beautiful, right? But when people take pictures of my performance and capture gesture, those are the moments where I feel like I got it, right? I think it is in movement that I'm doing LaWhore at her best, as opposed to in stillness. And so I recognize myself, I recognize LaWhore in documentation of live performance, especially. There's a picture that is going in the essay that has me doing this fisting motion, and it's one of my favorite numbers to do, but it's just a really great moment where I was like, that is what I was hoping I was giving to the audience, and when documentation captures gesture in those ways, it brings me a lot of joy in my own practice.
I ask also because I'm thinking as an academic or scholar wanting to engage and write about your work. It's important to kind of get a sense of how you feel these different iterations of your practice work. And I really enjoyed how you discussed this idea of circulation being actually maybe the important kind of point, less than an image being still, but it moving. And I just got on Instagram, so like I haven't been very active, but I feel like in many ways you guys are then curating images for us to consume, and there's a lot of thought put into what's happening, and that again as writers that we need to be really thinking about that. And how we then begin to consume and move these sort of images forward in other directions.
Can I say very quickly? So I perform on a lot of college campuses, and the hardest thing to acquire is good lighting. Like, it's real. Like, there's a lot, because drag is visual, right, and it's transforming the body and sculpting the body through makeup and dress. Without good lighting, you just sort of dissolve. And especially campus lighting. So when you have drag queens on your campuses, this is good lighting, right? Front lighting. But these are things I'm not a visual artist, and I didn't think about those things until people were taking pictures, and I was like, oh wait, can you please make sure there's some front lighting for my performance?
That's an interesting point you brought up as well, because there actually is this sort of historical racism involved in how lighting works with photography, and that it, surprise, surprise, doesn't really work so well for darker-skinned individuals. I have so many pictures of myself in school shots where you barely see that I'm even there at some level. So there's this interesting, just even within the mechanism of the photograph, that's working against you in some way. I wanted to move to this conversation about pastiche and parody, which both of you brought up. And what I think is so interesting and wonderful about your work is that there is parody, but it's not negative critique or biting irony. It is a sort of affirmative criticality. It moves things forward. And I'm wondering if you think that is the case, that is what's happening in your work, and what you think about that.
I mean, I think, when I hear parody, I'm thinking I think about Butler and the productive nature of repetition. But then there's so much of my performance that doesn't land in nightclubs because I'm parodying specific South Asian tropes. That the sari, that the auntie, that the snake woman, the woman whose husband has gone off to war, like all of these figures just don't land in the same way. And so I think one important thing that I think about in thinking about, or I want to name in thinking about parody, is that it's not a universal practice. It is deeply situated in its reference, even as the reference disappear and fade, right? The pleasure that comes from repetition and remaking are really situated in at least in my practice. And so I think that's, and sorry being a copy of Justin Bieber's Sorry, right? I think is a very clear, we know what it's parodying, but inside of it, there are all these other things that I'm trying to name that are not about just, actually that entire piece has nothing to do with Justin Bieber, right? I'm not referencing anything but the song, right? It's parodying a whole lot of other things that are more important to me than, as you said, critiquing whiteness in those ways. It's trying to do other work.
I think, in terms of the parody not being mockery, I think there's, it's complicated though, because with drag or with anything queer, I think the thing that so many people feel, in the straight world or in the art world or wherever, is that when you gay things up or when you queer things up, people don't take it seriously, right? There's an immediate feeling of that, and I think with your work and with my work, there is a sense of like, well, the comedy is the seriousness. This is something worth noting. Queer thought is serious thought. Queer thought is thought that needs to be heard and seen. So when I parody, when I think about Shahida Sanam Headley, my intention is not to make fun of her, but to bring her alive for people who may not have known her, and to bring her into queerness, into sort of a queer family. And while she may not have been queer, I think one thing that she proved was that while queerness is also about who you fuck, it's also about the systems that you try to fuck up. And I think that for me is an important takeaway. And it's also a way of thinking about like, well, where are, sometimes we have to make up these figures. Sometimes we have to parody histories and we have to parody movements in order to become a part of them, because they missed us out when they happened.
And I think humor, it's not just humor, but silliness and nonsense, and what Roy Perez calls critical flippancy when talking about Mark Aguihar's work, right? It's just these non-tangible, nonsensical ways of engaging and repeating, I think, and lip sync and eating flowers, right, is one of those ways that I think that we mess it up. And I think that queer performance is supposed to be silly because it does exactly that messy work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, one of the reasons I sort of asked this question is there's this really wonderful book by this British theorist Richard Dyer, and the book is called Pastiche, and he really argues that pastiche is embodied, and it can be a sort of criticism that isn't sort of negative, and I haven't really seen that thought of in the context of drag so much, and I see it so much in your work. I wanted to go back to these conversations on futurity. I remember when I first saw in the context of a title of your work, Queer Muslim Futures, and I was kind of blown away by that. I was like, oh, this seems like such an oxymoron, right? Like, and why is it an oxymoron? So, I mean, could you talk a little bit more about how futurity practices in both of your works?
Yeah. I mean, for me, what I found inspiring about futurity is that this idea that the future is inherently unknowable, which means it is a blank space, and it's a blank space in which we can tell stories and in which we can speculate. And I think for me, when queer Muslim futures, right? I'll get to the oxymoron part. But also, when thinking about Islam, so for me, Islam is the bedrock to my practice. Islam, many people don't know, but Islam doesn't call God Lord of the universe, it calls God Lord of the universes, right? It believes it insists on the possibility of many universes. It insists on the possibility of life in space. It insists that there are not two genders, but many. And in short, it insists on possibility. And I think, but for Shia Muslims, we have a saying, which is Kul arde Karbala, kul yawmi Ashura, which means every land is Karbala, every place, every time is Ashura. And Karbala was when the Prophet Muhammad's whole family was massacred by another Muslim regime. And Ashura was the last day when his grandson Hussein was killed, along with thousands of people. And so to say, Kul arde Karbala, kul yawmi Ashura, every land is Karbala, every day is Ashura, is to say that there is injustice everywhere, and that every day is a fight against it. So Islam provides so much in thinking about radical futures. It provides so much to the imagination. It's generous. Of course, there are problems, like with every organized religion. I don't mean to romanticize too much or to glorify too much, but for me, it has given me this much. So if it insists on possibilities, it insists on the possibility of a queer Muslim future. And I think it's interesting when people do see queerness and Islam as being somehow, not functioning together or being an oxymoron. And I remember I was really confronted with this when I curated a show in San Francisco called The Third Muslim. And the show received a lot of press, but it was all people who were like, well, the show is about how your families oppress you, right? Like how it's horrible and how like you've given up Islam and whatever. And it was like, no, actually it's about representation, the fact that we need to represent ourselves, and why am I talking to you? And anyway, so it was very, people wanted to hear a sob story. But queerness has existed in Islam for so long, we just haven't named it. And again, not to romanticize, because a lot of these stories are by men, but and women are often left out, or other genders. Oh, actually, no. It's mostly trans histories and queer histories that we see. But Islamic poetry is full of not just sort of like vague references to loving a man, but references to liking a man's like butt. Like this is also embedded in the very fabric of Muslim history is the radical possibility of love.
I get a little self-conscious around the question of futures and futurity, because I think, I'm not working with the shaman, zombie, robot, cyborg, spirit, right? Which I think are the tropes of futurisms, and so I feel like my drag is old or old school, or The dignified auntie, right, is who's horny but dignified, right? But also, you know, when you asked this question, it really got me thinking about, well, why do I do what I do, and who is the auntie? What is the auntie's goal in futurity? And there's so many ways in which the auntie is the figure that keeps giving, that does care work, that gives us life, even as she limits it, right, and says you have to do it this way, right? But it's still there is an investment in futurity, even in reusing yogurt containers as this practice of home-based environmentalism, right? But what is the work of the auntie work that passes on practice and resilience and survival, often through non-explicit forms of feminism. And why can't aunties give us queerness, right? Why can't that be one of the things that they keep extending into the future? So because I think they do see their work as futurist, right? They are invested in that, but how can we adjust some of the heteronormative expectations that they have of us as well?
Aunties are future-facing. They're forward-looking. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I love that you brought up this idea of how aunties, again, are sort of, old school or considered. In the past, the idea that futurity has always been there, or it is already there, we're just not looking for it on some level. So it's not necessarily about sort of temporality, something that hasn't happened, but perhaps it already has happened or is happening in some way. So it's really, really fascinating. The other thing I think that comes up a lot in different ways in your practices is notions of comedy for sure, and also death, and they seem like strange bedfellows often in your work. And the conjoining of those two is a difficult combination, I think, and yet it makes so much sense. And I'd love for you guys to talk a bit more about how these things come together for you, these ideas of the comedic and death. Or do they, I guess, yeah.
So I have so far performed, LaWhore has so far performed at 2 memorial services, and 2 weddings, right? There's a Hugh Grant movie in there somewhere. But really, like, it seemed like after the fact, they made sense, but when I was asked to do them, they were daunting, right? But reflecting on them is a reminder that queer nightlife has been a space of mourning, right? Fiona Buckland writes that for queer people who have lost friends and family during the HIV/AIDS crisis, returning to the big nightclubs in New York 10 or 20 years later was a way of mourning and remembering, right? And so drag's ability to hold gesture and memory and gift and give, right, are ways of engaging in ritual practices of death and mourning as well. So that's one of the ways I think about my relationship. It's relationship to death and loss. I was also asked to do a performance soon after the first issuing of a Muslim ban by the Trump administration, and that came very soon after also a bombing at the shrine of Lal Shahbaz Qalandar in Pakistan, and also the ongoing killing and lynching of Muslims and Dalits in India. So I put together a performance that danced with 3 versions of the song Damadam Masti Qalandar as its way of invoking my own auntie's auntie-hood, my auntie-hood, futurity, I guess, but also mourning and remembering as well. So those are 2 different answers, I think, but I really do think about the nightclub as a place to practice ritual, of both celebration and change, and as well as death and death.
Yeah, for sure. I've seen your performance of Ramada Mastakalandar, and I loved it so much. And yeah, no, I think, mentioning about the nightclub being a space of mourning, and I mean that is such a huge part of queer culture, because that's really been for us a somewhat shaky safe space as well, to be able to show feelings that we haven't otherwise, but that we can't otherwise. But I think what that also reminds me of this idea of dancing and death as well. And I'll bring her up again, but after Shahida Sanam Headley died, her remains were kept by the Israeli government till 2008, until there was a Hezbollah and Israeli government prisoner exchange, and with that they exchanged body parts as well, because that's a tactic that both sides use, because in Islam and Judaism both, you can't bury a body not whole. So this is what we know about each other. So in this prisoner exchange, when Shahida Sanam Headley's body was brought back to her family in 2008 to the town of Sur or Tyre in southern Lebanon, they followed what she had said, which is don't mourn for me, but dance for me. And they dressed up the coffin in a wedding dress, and the whole town wore wedding dresses, and the church bells were ringing, and the Muslim imams had come to do her wedding rites, and the Christian and Muslim community. There was a sort of celebration of her death, and a dancing of her death in what she had asked for. And I think there is, they are, and it may not be comedy, but joy brings laughter. And that was also drag, because everyone was wearing wedding dresses. So that's, it's a different kind of drag. So I think there is something sort of comedic about how morbid the world is. There is something that's truly absurd about these cycles of death and violence that we go through. And I think sometimes the only thing you can do is laugh, is to make people laugh, is to make sure people can smile and be joyous, despite the fact that there's this barrage of violence that people face every day. I was going to say something else, but I think that's it for now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This, you might have noticed when both of them were sort of, discussing their work, that they operate in a lot of different contexts. That is to say, on YouTube, at a bar, in an academic context. These are just a couple of the different types of context. Theater, in Sophie's case for sure. And I'm curious, all of these are very different modes, and what do they afford for you? And maybe you don't necessarily need to talk about all of them, but if you could discuss sort of these differences, so that we don't get a flattening out of your work, as if it's all the same, but you have chosen to use different vehicles to highlight different aspects, I imagine, of your practice.
Yeah, I mean, there's, in performance, like Kareem said, like LaWhore said earlier, the lighting being one thing, right? So you're thinking about space. You're thinking about what the space can offer. You're thinking about the audience as well. I mean, I think so much of a performance truly actually depends on the audience. So much of a reading, a poetry reading, a performance, whatever, depends on the audience and how receptive they are and what they want to be receptive to, and what the space can give you as well. And also, you're so vulnerable. You're there, you're so vulnerable. And I think within the drag nightclub, everyone has a sense of, okay, it's a nightclub, I know what people are coming in for. And I think in many ways, it's very, very, it's really wonderful. Like when you do a performance that people enjoy, it's like this instant gratification where you feel this love and people are throwing money at you, and then you're just like, what? And then you have to pick up the money off the floor, and then you're like, and you're like in your heels, and in your heels and like squatting and just picking up dollar bills. But it's, so there's that part too. But there is a sort of really beautiful instant gratification. But I think, but then going to an academic space or going into an art gallery space, perhaps even a theater, but especially academic and art gallery spaces, it's sort of like, well, just go, like do your thing, perform. like rip open your heart, like go ahead, it's fine, it's what you do, right? So, and I think that is something that is very very uncomfortable. But I think like we're I mean, maybe I should speak in I terms, but like there is an audience that we want to engage in that isn't always in the nightclub, or that doesn't always feel like they can be at the nightclub. And then there's also an audience in the academic and theater space that also doesn't feel welcome in the nightclub. So I think engaging with these spaces is important. And for me, the limits with drag that I felt was that, now I kind of, what I prefer to do is South Asian or Arab events or nightclub events, because I know there's an audience that not only gets what I'm saying, but I can take more liberties, I can be more nuanced. But now in a regular nightclub context, I actually don't like to perform because I remember once in a performance in a Castro, I don't know if you're all familiar with Castro, gay neighborhood in San Francisco, nightclub, and I did this comedy number where I did like a stand. This was before Faluda died. I did this like stand-up thing, and I opened with I lip-synced to my own voice where I said, when I first came to the United States, I had so many things to learn, like the difference between Twinkies and Twinks and white fragility. I also learned that there are people in America who hate queers and they hate Muslims too. So I thought, what if I put the two together? So and then I took off what I was wearing and I did a Nancy Ajram belly dance number, and I just remember feeling like people were eating me, like people were eating me, like there was like these eyes that just made me feel so. Small, not small, but I don't know, like I was being digested, but not in a good way, like what I was saying wasn't being digested, I was being craved in some way, just to fill some desire, and that became exhausting, which is why a lot of my work ended up shifting more to theater spaces where I think you can express more as well, and that's where I'll leave it.
Just to follow up on what you were saying, one of my students said they were at my performance at JHO in Chicago, and the performance finished, and they were clapping, and this white man next to them put their hands on theirs and said, no, they're just doing their culture. It's not, you don't need to clap for it, right? So this reading of like doing Nanti Ajram or doing Bollywood as being just doing your culture, and not, so again, the parody, like my brilliant parody of Devdas was like, cut down to you're just doing your culture, right? But I love performing in nightclub spaces, and specifically QTPOC, queer trans people of color spaces, where even if people are not getting the actual reference, there's a generosity, there's a joy in being in those spaces with each other. There's sort of an ecstasy of already being with each other. Because we don't get to as often. When I'm in a classroom space, on the projection, when I do a number that is I Will Survive in 3 different languages, and I'm just projecting a disco ball, right, and just using that to transform the space quickly and say we're at the nightclub, folks, right, is one of the ways that I. So using visuals, again, I don't create original visuals myself, but using visuals to turn so even if there's terrible lighting, fluorescent lighting, at least I've got the backdrop to say, hey, we're at the nightclub together. But you have to do a lot of work to train people to respond like they're at the nightclub. I love what you do when you, at least at the performance we did together, you gave people currency notes from different from
the Muslim banned countries.
Yes. Yeah. To tip you, right? But just a lot of when performing on campuses, a lot of young people have never seen a live drag show. They've only seen RuPaul's Drag Race or things on TV, because they're not able to get into nightclubs, or if they're on small college campuses and have come from small towns, they haven't had as much access to nightclubs. Not that there isn't nightlife in smaller towns. So just teaching them, like, okay, instead of raising your hand, you scream and shout, right? In the class, when you're responding to a drag artist, those little tactics of training folks to be with you are one of the things that LaWhore does at the top of the show, in order to make the classroom feel like a nightclub.
So, I mean, you've written a really interesting article about how there are lots of queer South Asian performers out there, and I'm interested in talking about that as well, because we were just, kind of discussing the kind of sometimes the specific contexts which need to be at play for an audience to really get the nuances, like in Dave Dust, but it certainly hasn't stopped the proliferation of number of different South Asian performers. Do you want to share, is there one or two performers that you really enjoy that you'd love to kind of give a shout out to while you're here? You can say more than one or two.
In New York City, there's Sundari Indian Goddess, who is a Caribbean South Asian queen who performs at queer events, but performs at community-based events as well. Like mostly straight audiences at weddings, and she turns it out there too. And again, she finds a way to activate the crowd through the repertoires that are familiar between them, right? And there's a smartness to her work that she's able to bring her queer fun and silliness, but also pander to uncle auntie expectations of what a good dance performance looks like. And I just think she's brilliant in the way that she moves. She code switches through her performances. Now that you're asking me, there are all these names that are not coming to mind. So I'll stop there. I'll think of more. Are there?
Oh my goodness, this is what I call a blank. I think there's always this search. Do you want to shout one of you?
Yeah,
are you feeling inspired? Okay.
Bijuria, you talk about her.
No, you do.
Okay.
You do.
She's in Montreal, and she's a musicologist who uses her magnificent command over sound to do these lip syncs that are sometimes garbled noise, and she moves between French and English and Hindi in her lip syncs, and is just weird and fun and good and kind to her audiences. But really her manipulation of sound through her body and through her mouth that is not making the sounds is just incredible.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot here.
Ditto. Holy poo. But it's just, there's so many names there's so many Instagram profiles I'm like visioning right now, and I'm just like, shit. Well, LaWhore Vagistan. Sister, auntie, informal mother, I would say. We are our own mothers. And I mean, I was actually I was on a little tour, which was very fun, around the world, searching for the next intifada, finding different queer Muslim performers, and I would like to bring up one name of someone, or no, actually two names, and they're not South Asian. I'm sorry, is that okay? I know it's fine. They're Arab and North African, but one of them is Yusuf Iskander, who they did this performance where they just danced to a recitation of the 99 names of Allah, in this really, because Allah has, if you're not familiar, Allah has 99 names, which are the different attributes of God, and they just did this beautiful dance to that, and then they did this very angry, so Shias, we have a chest-beating culture where we sort of put ourselves in pain to mimic the pain of others, and there was this sort of queer anger to it that was just beautiful. And then another one's Cabaret Sheikhats, and they're based in Morocco, and they're a troupe of drag queens that do this very, very, very old style of kind of like, I think it's called tarab, where it's like this beautiful like group Sufi music that's often done by women, and there's usually questions that are asked and there's responses. Anyway, really beautiful. I think people are really pushing the edges of not only what it means to be Asian or South Asian or Muslim, but also what it means to be queer.
We definitely want to have the audience have time to have questions, and there are more that I have, but you can sort of, I think, read some of the answers to those in this journal that I mentioned earlier. So we can sort of open it up to everyone.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your experience is performing in the diaspora versus performing at, I don't know where you identify as home, but performing in South Asia or performing, and how that changes things for you or doesn't change things for you.
Those are the questions I was going to ask. It's perfect. I know I did you in the audience.
So I just did a workshop in Accra, Ghana. It was the first time I'd been back there in 18 years. And I did a performance workshop with young queer and trans folks, and I wasn't in drag, but just, or in like dress drag, but just sort of did a little number with them, and there was something especially restorative to me about being there, and being able to do that now, having grown up there and never being able to engage publicly with queerness there. Even though I did at home, as that picture suggested before. Performing in India, where my parents have now retired and I've done research and built a community, my Bollywood numbers didn't really land very well because I wasn't as good as the queens there. But they lived for my Celine Dion, It's All Coming Back to Me, which just evidences the universal power of Celine Dion, really. It's just, people keep messaging me about how much they remember that. So I feel good about that.
Yeah, this is a very for me in my mind it's a real conflict. I recently went back to Pakistan, actually just a few weeks ago, and I had a solo exhibition there, and that video that I spoke about before was in that solo exhibition, and there were big gruff men who have known my family for a very long time, who are not at all engaged in conversations about queerness, who saw the video, and I go through 3 different languages. And they were some people said, "Wow, you're teaching the next generation that it's okay to fight." And I remember, there was a video about my art practice that went viral at one point because there was like a 10-second clip in the beginning, or not even 10-second clip in the beginning of me in drag, and that was the thing that got viral, and then it was played in GIFs, and it was. As opposed to sort of what I said after. And it was very problematic in some ways, but a lot of, in Pakistan, especially, outside of elite urban cultures, people are very engaged in Sufi mysticism in a way that is far more, sort of philosophically advanced than the urban elite who are very westernized. And there were folks who were saying like, oh, he's dancing like a Sufi, like he's a dervish, he's a dervish. And they interpret it in this way. They interpreted drag as a kind of ego foregoing or whatever. But I don't perform in Pakistan as a rule, because for now, not necessarily because of issues of safety, but because I'm not sure what the audience intention might be just yet, and I haven't brought myself to that place. But I did go back and talk to queer youth who are youth. I'm not sure how many were queer actually, but youth in Karachi, high school students as well as university students, about queer issues, about queer politics, and it was amazing to see how receptive people were to ideas around these things. And it gave me the confidence to think, oh well, actually, things are changing. There's a real shift in consciousness that's happening. And 10 years ago, I would have never have used the word queer in a conversation with high school students in Pakistan. It was unimaginable. It was like talking to them about, it was like using a series of swear words. Like it was not okay. And yeah, there's a shift in consciousness happening that is building a lot of confidence in me. If that answers your question.
Sort of a follow-up, actually, to your question. First of all, thank you for such a rich conversation, and Alpesh, you're like the master moderator, so thank you. But to follow up, I'm thinking about how both of your performances really disarrange South Asia as a category, right? And so, for you, the figure of the auntie is routed through Ghana, right? And so that's really sort of a kind of origin point for you that's not really an origin, right? And then for you, I mean, it's Lebanon, right? And so for both of you, I think South Asia itself sort of kind of expands, disintegrates, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
One of the things LaWhore does when she shows the map of Vagistan is to say, this is a much more expansive, expansive view of South Asia that extends into China, extends into the Middle East, right? Because of the reach of the fallopian tubes. Right? But just yeah, biology, yes. No, but really to dismantle some of the borders around what we consider the subcontinent, but also to use storytelling alongside image, alongside the visual of the auntie, like there in her sari, like all of those things layered on each other. Talking about my own aunties in that moment, I think it's in performance again that I'm able to do that work of layering. And this is why I think performance to me is such an important mode. One of my mentors, D. Soini Madison, says performance has the capacity to layer sensation and meaning up on each other over and over again. And then there's what happens with the audience, right? I do this thing with students. I say, here's your drag name. It's a pet's name and your place of birth. And then I ask a few people, what is your drag name? And one of them at a show at Hamilton College was like, Chichi Ghana. And we got to have this moment, right? So the whole audience is seeing this nice South Asian drag queen, and suddenly we're talking about Ghana and growing up there together. So I think the geopolitics of drag are really exciting because it's on the very body. You can disarrange meaning, and then through dance also. When I'm doing Nicki Minaj, right, citing her South Asianness through Trinidad and into the U.S. and bringing blackness and brownness together in those ways are just some of the ways that I'm trying to be unruly about geography.
I just want to touch on that for a little bit. I know maybe we're running out of time, but I mean, I'm glad you bring that up because I often have this feeling of being in a South Asian space and then bringing up Arab history, or being in an Arab space and then bringing South Asian history. I'm always doing this weird thing, but I think for me, like the politics and waves of migrations as well. Like my father moved to Syria because he was escaping a brutal dictatorship in Pakistan that specifically targeted him and him and those who politically aligned. And then my mother had left Lebanon because of the civil war to find a job, and they met in Syria, and they had me there. And I was always raised of this sense that our struggles are the same. Our struggles are united. Our struggles are linked. And sometimes we have to move in order to survive. And I try and bring that into my drag as well. And also to say, yeah, we are, of course we are very distinct cultures, but we are one world in that sense. We have a worldview, we share experiences.
I wonder if you would, I guess, just bluntly ask, what is the most unlikely influence that you think other people would be surprised about on you in terms of your work in this category?
My drag mother's name is Rhonda Jules. She is, I think, 12 or 13 years younger than me. She's a horror drag queen in Austin, Texas. But everything that I do is informed by her sensibility. She's not famous, she's not, but she hosts an excellent drag brunch in Austin. And really she's really left her mark on mentoring me. And I know that's sort of not the popular culture answer you were hoping that we could all share. But really that, she's really completely unlikely influence. The day we were paired up in this drag competition, she was like, this is not gonna work. and 10 weeks later, we won as a mother and daughter, and really like it was beautiful to work with her.
I mean, it's a lot of the 60s, funnily enough. I mean, actually it's a lot of the 60s, the zombie and the makeup. One influence is definitely Noor Jahan, Pakistani singer. Really love her, you should look her up. Definitely got my eye makeup from her. Who did Monica, my darling? What Rachel?
Oh,
Helen, thank you. Helen. And also zombies from classic 1960s Hollywood. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say thank you for being here and for making this kind of space for this audience, because it's very healing for me to be in these kind of spaces, because I don't typically have the opportunity to have spaces that are both Muslim and queer, or Muslim and Arab, or Muslim just global South, generally speaking. I think what really struck me in the conversation today was the comment on this oxymoron of being queer and Muslim. And so I wanted you to maybe elaborate more on why is that an oxymoron in the first place, and how is it that your work sort of bridges that hypothetical oxymoron? Yeah.
Well, I this I think was something that I addressed a little bit, and thank you for being here. Also, thank you for saying what you said. It's an oxymoron because the West decided it was, because liberal America, liberal Europe, believed that Islam was the anti to progress, that Islam was the anti to modernization, that Islam was the anti to secular values, that the West believes that it is the guard of. And queerness has now become, unfortunately, dare I say so, a form of imperialism. Not queerness, gayness has become a form of imperialism. It is saturated in liberal notions of respectability, of money making, of capitalism, and of Islamophobia, and of anti-religiousness. And it follows the same trope as many Orientalists did before, which is that the Muslim or the Arab, regardless of religion, or the South Asian, regardless of religion, but the Muslim becomes this sort of symbolic figure, is the savage, is the barbarian, and is only not the barbarian when they have been westernized, right? When they have embraced liberal, secular, American and European values. And I think a lot of the work that I try to do is fuck your secularism, fuck these values, fuck your respectability. You don't know Islam, you don't know these things, and those kinds of values are very oppressive. And I think that's why people think of it as an oxymoron. So bringing them together, is, perhaps an act of resistance.
So I grew up in a Hindu family that was very committed to syncretic religious practices, and as a Sindhi family, and which is how I ended up with a name like Kareem that my aunties hate, and several aunties have renamed me and refused to use the name for me. But part of teaching about Islamophobia during my performance is also doing caste critique and thinking through violence against Muslims and Dalits in more and more fundamentalist India and Indian diaspora. So doing that work together is very important to me.
And I also just want to add, like, I think what Western liberalism has also done is this segmenting.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Sindhi culture is one of the most syncretic in South Asia. There are still many Hindus who live in Sindh in Pakistan right now, and Sindhi Hinduism brings in, maybe you can talk about this more, but Sindhi Hinduism brings into its fold the teachings of Guru Nanak, the Sikh gurus. It brings into its fold the teachings of Sufi Muslims, and it also believes in Muhammad as a sacred figure, the Prophet Muhammad as a sacred figure, and this is why we emphasize our Sindhiness all the time. It's not that we're regionalists. We're genuinely happy that there is Sindhiness, believes in being together. Even Sindhi Muslims also believe in being together. Sindhi Muslim shrines welcome Hindu believers. Sindhi Sufi Muslim saints have welcomed Hindu followers and do not ask them to convert. So yeah, that's a little ethnography. There you go.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. My questions are probably going to sound a little bit frivolous after that brilliant set of answers, but I've been thinking about two kind of practical aspects of both of your performance that I find really intriguing, and one is tipping, and I'm really curious about tipping because it exposes the artistic labor of drag and also is so specific to the nightclub as a site of drag. So I'm curious about what you both have learned from tipping, like who tips, when do they tip, do South Asians tip? So that's question one. And then the second question I have is about hair. And part of the reason I'm intrigued by that is because I think hair sort of, in some ways, is one of the most terrifying things about sort of the boundary of race and gender in the work that both of you do. So I'm curious about how you make decisions about hair, facial hair, wigs, all of that stuff. So those are the
I'll start with the tipping one. So some of my favorite moments in performance have been when a select few South Asians have actually tipped. That is to say, they don't always or often tip. But that also gestures to how often they go to queer nightclubs and know this practice, right? So that's one of the things at play there is a familiarity with the kind of reciprocity, practices of reciprocity in the nightclub. But there are a couple of times that people have come up to me and taken their dollar bills and wrapped them around my head before stuffing them in my bra, right? Or someone has like handed me a bill and then like taken the evil eye off of me, right? And so there are these moments that like the act of giving the money is what you would do with Sufi musicians or other dancers or dancers at weddings or hijras at weddings. I'm still waiting for someone to do what they do at hijra performances where they take a full stack of bills and throw it. But so one day, but there are these like very particular ways of giving money and tipping that are located in South Asianness that bring me a lot of joy. I'll think about hair. You go.
Ditto on that one. Yeah, I mean, yeah, not many do, but when they do, it's like a really amazing moment. But hair, I mean, as you can tell, I'm bald. Balding and bald. No, but that's like not balding. And I think, and I do a full wet shave when I perform. One, because I think it's a bit more scary. It's a bit more stark. It's more of a contrast. And yeah, I think also, not I think, but I know that I also have not yet fully settled, like, you know, what is a futuristic drag queen, military, what kind of wig does she wear? You know, like I don't know, does she just wear a hat? And you know, there was, even when I wasn't the dead person, I still felt weird about wigs. I wasn't so into wigs. They kind of took it somewhere for me where I wasn't quite like wanting it to go. So I would cover my hair. I would do the bald look, and I would put a dupatta or a scarf over my head, which again was a very sort of stark look. So it kind of became just an aesthetic where I was like, no, I do not wear wigs. I do plan on doing a Noor Jahan thing at some point, so I'll need a big wig for that. But and keeping the facial hair. Sorry, yeah, that's what I forgot about. A lot of people, it's interesting. A lot of people are very curious about, like, oh, you're a drag queen, but you have a beard. And it's like, well, yeah, bearded drag queen. You know, that's, I guess for me, it's like, well, that's a thing. Of course it is. But for a lot of people, I think that's kind of confusing. And I think, you know, keeping the beard, I think, puts Faluda into a category of not, you know, of not necessarily doing male drag or female drag or faux drag or drag. You know, there's an ambiguous place. You know, and if she exists in the future, then her gender is also, of course, in an ambiguous place because we have destroyed it. But other than that, yeah, I think that's as best as I can answer that question.
Well, I'll say that I've learned that I really look beautiful as a blonde. Like, but there are these moments where getting ready, I learn a lot about. I have these really intimate moments with myself and putting things on or taking things off. And when I shaved one of the times I did drag, when I shaved my chest and arms, I didn't recognize my body, right? And it was a deep discomfort with seeing my body in those ways. And so keeping the hairs for me, it works in particularly politicized ways to say the auntie can be hairy, right? But in, you know, transforming my face through makeup doesn't produce that effect, that kind of discomfort with myself that removing body hair does. And so that is definitely something I do for myself that works well with the larger story and telling about who auntie is.
I think we're out of time. But thank you so much for your generosity today. I really appreciate your generosity. And thank you all for coming.